I've got the mystical ability to do what exactly? I've got a pair of bachelor uncles, Roger and Stanley. They live together in my Nana's old house, the one my dad grew up in. I asked my dad once whether he'd ever thought about living with them before he met my mom, and he just stared at me in silent horror. It's not like they're awful people, don't get me wrong, they just have very established personalities. Roger is chronically grumpy. Pessimism is his defining personality trait. He's actually very kind, deep, deep down. He'd give you the shirt off his back, but he'd complain the whole time and bring it up twice a year for the rest of his life, maybe even on his deathbed. Stanley drinks. Not in a messy or unpleasant way. He's actually rather cheery, because of the booze. He hasn't had a driver's license for years, but he's everybody's best friend on public transportation. We nieces and nephews call them our grumple and our drunkle. I mention Roger and Stanley because, like most of us, the day superpowers became real was a defining moment in both of their lives. Roger, whose personal motto is, "There's always a catch," felt super vindicated when superheroism turned out to be much messier than anyone ever thought it could be. Stanley just kicked his drinking up a notch. Considering how world-changing the whole superpowers thing was, it began with virtually no drama. There was no meteor, there was no crack in the sky with a giant eye looking through it, there was no dramatic background music. We just woke up one morning and something like 0.5% of people around the world suddenly had paranormal abilities. And while that doesn't sound like a lot, it was still almost 1.5 million people in the United States alone. Suddenly, there were formerly normal, everyday people among us who could do extraordinary things. But as my grumple Roger would be the first to tell you, there's always a catch. It turns out that most of the dramatic, mythic-level superpowers we'd all dreamt of had an unfortunate weakness. Physics. Take flying, for instance. Just because you could streak through the sky at a couple 100 miles an hour didn't make you immune to bugs. Catching a Japanese beetle in the face at speed was like getting hit with a golf ball right off the tee. And then, people being people, the first flyers wore headphones. Of course they did, because what could be more awesome than swooping through the air blasting Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries, or Guns N' Roses at full volume? Well, definitely not getting sucked into a jet engine you didn't hear approaching you. And let's not even get into the dozens of men and women who changed altitude too casually and dropped screaming from the sky with the bends. And then there's super strength. Simply being incredibly strong didn't mean you necessarily had a body rugged enough to deal with it. It turns out that it's no good being strong enough to crush rocks with your bare hands if that amount of force breaks all your fingers. Countless men, and it was always men, threw out their backs by lifting cars to show off for their girlfriends without stretching properly beforehand. There was the strong man, imaginatively called the strongest man, who called a press conference to witness him lifting the main branch of the New York Public Library, the one with the lions in front, over his head. Just because he was strong and robust enough to lift a classic stone and brick building didn't give the building itself the structural integrity to be lifted. He actually lifted it for about 3 seconds before it crumbled around him, burying him in books and granite blocks. New heroes, and more than a few aspiring villains, destroyed their ankles phasing through walls and bank vaults, only to find themselves sinking through the floor. It's a psychological thing, but most phasers went through their first walls at full sprint, like they felt like they needed to build up a head of steam to blast through. The ones with fast reaction times noticed themselves sinking when they were ankle deep in the floor, panicked and turned off their powers, freezing their feet in place and snapping their ankles in a way that was really difficult to come back from. The slower-witted ones phased completely through the floor, still moving at a full sprint, then panicked and stopped phasing, only to careen dramatically into a wall, then smash into the floor, again, usually breaking an ankle. A certain type of staggering gait became known as phaser's limp among physical therapists. Interestingly enough, it was some of the most underpowered supers who used their abilities in the most interesting ways. It's entirely likely, by the way, that there are thousands of lightly powered people who never bothered making a big deal out of their powers, and we just don't know about them. There are also probably people whose powers are so subtle that they themselves haven't ever noticed them. But there was a kid in Missouri who could levitate, about 5 inches above the ground. He ended up joining the Marines, who recognized a good thing when they saw it and put him into explosive ordnance disposal. He could stand directly over a pressure plate or a landmine without setting it off. Apparently, he's the head of the Atlanta Police Department's bomb squad now. And there was a telekinetic from Honolulu who could move objects with her mind, but nothing heavier than a postage stamp. She became a brilliant surgeon who's called in for the most delicate operations, repairing torn blood vessels in a baby's eye, for instance, jobs that are too delicate for human hands. But the reason I bring all this up is because a friend of mine had what might loosely be called an adventure last week. Tanya has a medical superpower too. She can regrow missing toes. Only toes. Not fingers, not internal organs, just toes. But she's in pretty high demand to replace toes that patients have lost to frostbite or industrial accidents, and even occasionally birth defects that have left a child toe deficient. There's an operation that's been possible for many years now, replacing a missing thumb with a patient's big toe. It looks a little strange, but universally people who've had the procedure have been pleased to have their hands look odd if they can get back some grip strength and mobility in that hand. Or now, the surgeons can book a session with Tanya, who can do the whole job in about half an hour. She also travels with Doctors Without Borders a few months of the year, helping give toes back to victims of landmines. Tanya's really cute, about 5'0", with big blue eyes and a fondness for cardigans and sparkly necklaces. She could easily be Miss May on a 12 Months of Pretty Librarians calendar, which I guess is why some creep thought he could attack her. She was walking to meet some friends for trivia night at a pub last Saturday when this guy grabbed her and dragged her into an alley behind a dumpster. It all went down really fast. He bent over her, but she surprised him by grabbing his hair with one hand and shoving 2 fingers up his nostrils with the other. So here's the thing. Apparently, it's incredibly hard to breathe with a couple of toes up your nose, but that's nothing compared to the agony involved when a pair of big toes suddenly expand inside the most sensitive parts of your nasal cavities. Tanya is awesome. My Uncle Roger has a crush on her. There's something that drives me crazy. If you look up a recipe on a website and in the comments, someone will say, well, I'm trying to not eat so much sugar, so I didn't add any sugar to this. And my husband's vegan, so I didn't put any eggs. And I wasn't really happy with the way this turned out. I'm not impressed. Right? So I'm trying to a large extent to use the ingredients I heard about for this new cocktail. Okay, we're going to rim a glass. Now, normally I would do this with lime juice or something, but they specified simple syrup. Okay, and then sanding sugar, or in this case, coconut sugar. It's a coarse, kind of golden sugar, and it's going to give us a nice, pretty rim. And let's fill this maybe 3/4 of the way up with ice. And I'm doing it 1 cube at a time so I don't knock off any of the sugar. All right. Now, this called for cherry vodka and coconut vodka, which I don't have, and I don't even know where I would find that. So instead of the cherry vodka, I'm using Kirsch. It's a cherry liquor. It is pretty high octane. And we're going to put 1 ounce of that in. But that's got our cherry covered. And it also, the recipe I got this from, also called for come on, there you go. Also called for 1 ounce of coconut vodka. I don't think I've ever heard of coconut vodka, so we're going to use coconut rum. And there's 1 ounce of that. The proportions on this are really easy to keep straight. And because this is a Superman cocktail, we want a nice red color. So this calls for a full ounce of grenadine. That seems like a lot. But follow the directions, at least the first time. Okay. And checking my instructions. Okay, now, supposedly, I'm supposed to shake this like I am Superman. Frankly, I think Superman would do this with a little more style. Okay, we're going to pour this right down the middle. Again, not washing off any of the sanding sugar. And, well, I have to hand it to this person. That is a beautiful red color. Can't complain about that. Now, for the second half of this, we're going to use a mixing glass instead of a cocktail shaker. And we're going to add, let's see if you anticipated this. We're going to add another full ounce of blue curacao. And to keep this from being just one giant glass of syrup, we're going to put some mixer in. And this called for 2 ounces of Sprite. So, there we go. 1, 2, moja, mbili, hana, dul. Okay, 2 ounces. Now, we're using a mixing glass instead of a cocktail shaker because we want the soda to keep some of its fizz. So we get to break out the bar spoon, which I like. And we're just chilling and diluting this a little bit. Now, the instructions said, pour this, trying to find a way to gracefully strain out the ice cubes. Pour this right down the middle, which we have. Oh, hey. Huh. Well, that definitely looks like Superman colors. You got your blue, you got your red, and wow, that is sweet. I mean, if I wasn't a diabetic already, this might actually do in my pancreas. But does it taste like coconut? Yes. Does it taste like rum? Yes. Does it taste like cherries? Yes. So, would I make this again? I probably would, but I'm going to make a few changes. Instead of rimming the glass with sugar, I would rim it with something that would break up the sweet on sweet on sweet. So maybe some Tajin, that chili lime powder. And I think the Sprite was just a little too much. So I will, next time I make this, switch that out for regular club soda. Okay. Now, there's another way you could look at this, though, because if you did wake up one morning and you found you had superpowers, what would you say? Sweet. So maybe this is appropriate after all.